Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to get into pathological liars, which, as I mentioned last week, can be kind of entertaining to talk about, but can be very difficult to deal with. And so I thought it would be fun to think of some pathological liars like that are in the media, right? Or that are well known.
Okay, wait. You never responded to my email.
I didn't.
Most prominent pathological liar is, without a question, it's Donald Trump.
Oh, okay.
If you want to go there, I'm fine to go there. But without a doubt, he is the best example.
Yeah. Okay. Apparently Mark emailed me 2 days ago talking about Trump being a pathological liar. So politics aside, this is, I think, good to break down. Okay. But here's the thing. I think he believes his lies. Maybe that's an important place to start. I think oftentimes pathological liars genuinely believe their own lies. What do you think?
Oh, I think you're right.
Okay.
I think that often they realize they're lying, but then, we're jumping ahead in your outline as far as what is the reason. I think if you want to talk about Trump, you have to think about what is the reason. So you could I agree with you. You could stick politics aside because I would guess in his business dealings in his life, and I never watched the TV show, but I think in all aspects of his life, he's done this. And so I don't know that it has anything to do with politics. The only reason politics are a part of it is that's what we're seeing right now. Yeah. It's front and center in the national view. So I think he is the best current example of a pathological liar.
I would agree with that statement. I mean, and love him or hate him, it's true. And I think the biggest lies he tells are about himself.
Yeah. Well, yes. That's true. He tells big lies about himself, but also about other things. But you're right. He builds himself up. But so one of the questions in your outline was, well, where does it come from? So first, pathological lying is not a standard diagnosis in the DSM-5, but it's pretty widely accepted as being something that people deal with. So there's certainly been research on it, and mental health professionals talk about it, and they talk about it in terms of pathological lying. It's just not, I can't give you a diagnosis. But one of the things that the researchers who look at pathological lying, it occurs or starts fairly young, which I think is probably true. And one of the questions you asked was, what is it a result of? Like, could it be childhood trauma? And I think that's one aspect. I think the other is, so if you look at the word pathological, what that means is there's some sort of underlying mental health issue that is behind it. So, you could think of all the other, they've divided lying into all these different categories, which I didn't know there was so many categories. Some people tell what they call white lies, they tell untruths to protect others' feelings. An occasional liar, an habitual liar, a compulsive liar, prolific liar. Even a prolific liar is not a pathological liar. And so the difference that I think is critical is some underlying mental health issue. Okay. Now, I think that most mental health professionals have said this, that he has strong tendencies towards a narcissistic personality disorder mixed with an antisocial personality disorder. So that, to me, is the underlying pathology for him.
Which makes sense to me because, I don't know that anybody loves Trump more than Trump.
Well, you said something that triggered me, and you said he makes up the biggest lies about himself, which I think is true. And if you think about narcissistic personality disorder, which we've talked about in the past, and this is what I'm going to say is somewhat controversial. Not everyone doesn't agree. I think there are two types of the narcissistic personality disorder, and one people call compensatory narcissism. personally, I think that's probably what he has is compensatory narcissism, which is he has incredibly low self-esteem, and which then he flips it around to say the way he deals with it is I'm the greatest person alive.
Hmm.
I'm the greatest this, I'm the greatest that. And so I think it's a different type of narcissism than, believing truly you are the greatest person. A lot of therapists really think that all narcissism is compensatory narcissism. I
Okay.
want to acknowledge that the basis of narcissism is low self-esteem. I don't believe that, and
Yeah.
there was a woman at the University of Utah, widely considered to be an expert in personality disorders. She didn't believe that either. That there are actually ways that you create someone who truly believes they're the best person in the world. But anyway, that's probably too much talk about pathology. So that to make someone a pathological liar, or to say, oh, this person's a pathological liar, I think there definitely has to be some underlying pathology.
Well, and the interesting thing too is all children lie. It's
Right,
normal for
right.
kids to lie, and usually they do it to avoid, some sort of trouble or emotional distress, right? Because, and I
Hmm.
think often it's because they don't want to disappoint their parents or they don't want to get into trouble about something. And so it's very normal for children to lie. And as adults, it's our job to teach them. So does it start in childhood usually?
What the researchers saying is usually between the ages of 10 and 20 is when it
Oh,
starts to
okay.
come out. So a little
Interesting.
bit later, but I think the issue with children lying, absolutely true. I'm I'm having trouble remembering the name of a book, and it'll probably come to me. But the name of this book talks about it as a developmental phase that children go through, and it has to do with the relationship with the parents. It's really an interesting take on it.
Yeah.
That so you're absolutely right that when children lie, then it's our job to help guide them
Yeah.
into a different space. And a lot of parents get really upset and concerned if their children lie, and not realizing this. You know what? This is the normal stage that kids go
Yeah.
through.
Yeah.
So I think that going back though to you mentioned in your outline, could it be a result of childhood trauma? And I think that's absolutely a possibility. Because I think what happens is with trauma and other types, I mean, we're talking about abuse when we talk about
Yeah.
trauma, but
Yeah.
I think kids are amazing in their ability to develop coping mechanisms
Right.
to get through, difficult situations. And so I think that lying often is a coping mechanism that
Hmm.
people develop. And so it makes sense to me the age range that people are saying this is when it starts also corresponds to you know a developed coping mechanism as a result of some sort of trauma or abuse.
Right, exactly. And they learn it as a way to protect themselves. Children will lie as a means of avoiding the pain. And
Right.
again, it's a coping mechanism, and that's not their fault, right?
No.
They are being abused and they are just trying to protect themselves. Now whether this is the case with Trump, who knows? I don't think I'm particularly interested in trying to psychoanalyze Trump's
Oh,
childhood.
no. No, I don't know that there's any abuse. I have no idea. I have absolutely no knowledge
Yeah.
of where he came from. I think it's more likely that it's a result of these underlying pathologies and his personality disorder.
Yes. And the final thing I want to say about Trump is it's okay if you like him, it's okay if you support him, and it's okay, and it's also okay if you disagree with us. If you don't think Trump is a pathological liar, that's fine. But the
Right.
point I'm trying to make is
Right.
I don't want to alienate listeners, or I don't want, people to think we're just attacking Trump, or being super political. We're trying to put politics aside and saying we have this instance of a pathological liar who is very, very much thrown into the media
Yeah.
very often. And, it's okay if you disagree.
Right.
We'll move
Right.
on. So,
Right. He's been doing this forever. So I mean,
yeah,
it's not
yeah,
like he became involved in politics and decided to do this.
yeah.
And this is part of who he is. So.
It is. He believes his lies. And I think that is a common trait with
Hmm.
pathological liars is I think they
Hmm.
often They often believe their own lies. That's what can make it so hard to deal with, is
Right.
the fact that
Right.
they genuinely believe it. Okay, so if you have a person in your life who is a
Yeah.
pathological liar, so someone that is really the main purpose of today's episode, because I would say the biggest ramification is lack of trust. You
You're right.
can't trust
Absolutely.
them.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
can't trust them. And so, to have a really viable interpersonal relationship, you need to have trust. I
Yeah.
mean, it doesn't matter if it's an intimate partner, a spouse, or a friend. I mean,
Yeah.
if you think about if you had a friend who was a pathological liar, I mean, I personally wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't want to
Hmm.
be around someone who you could never trust.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think about what would happen if you had a spouse and you found out was a pathological liar. Now, I encounter that in the office sometimes, it's not all
Hmm.
the time, where there is one of the partners lies all the time, and that is the reason they're coming in.
Right.
I don't use terms like that in describing couples, at least to themselves, because it's not helpful. Like if I said,
Right.
well, you're a pathological liar, that's not really helpful. And
Hmm.
so if you just go with the behavior and in the relationship, often what it is, it's a habit, which,
Mm. Yeah.
pathological liars can develop a habit too. And it just becomes an automatic response. Now, some things I've read talk about it almost in terms of like a component of being OCD. So
Mm.
more of a compulsive
Interesting.
behavior. Like,
Yeah.
I have this compulsion to lie. And part of that can come, from the thrill of lying. I mean, for some people, I'm going to get away with this lie. I think you can probably get a bit of a dopamine hit on that. And so it becomes very difficult in relationships because it's hard to change.
Hmm.
I think you can change it. I believe you can
Yeah.
break the habit. So I'm not saying you can't do that. It's just if you were in a marriage, say, and, it came out after a time that the person really, I don't know if we want to use pathological or just the person lies all the time,
Yeah.
then what would you do? I don't know what I would like. How do you stay in a relationship like that? And that's a question
I
I'm
don't
throwing out
know.
there. I don't know how one does that.
Okay, let's take a quick break and we will be right back.
What you do in this moment matters. Join us for the Upstander Ripple Effect podcast for stories of people using their character strengths to be the best of humanity today. Hear from the son of Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, who reflects on his father's life and legacy. And from a Catholic nun who forged a friendship with the father of Anne Frank. Both will leave you inspired to start your own ripple of change. Download the Upstander Ripple Effect podcast today.
Well, I mean, I would guess that they rushed. I mean, the only thing I can think of is they rushed into the relationship, because that's the kind of thing that will come out over time, right?
Hmm.
Or that will come out,
Right.
or at least if someone is lying consistently, that's got to come out pretty quickly, you would
Right.
think. I mean,
Well,
because,
except how we've talked about in the early stages of a relationship forming, people change their behavior all
right,
the time.
right.
So I
Yeah.
think there's a possibility that people can hide it because they're
Mm,
trying to put forward their best self
yeah,
in
that's
in
true.
the early stages of the relationship. And so I think, especially in the cases where, which I see often, you get married too soon or you move in together too soon without really knowing the person, then I think it could catch you off guard. Because I see it in my office. It happens occasionally where,
Yeah.
people have married 10 years and, they finally figured out this person lies all the time.
Well, I mean, and maybe it could be situational, right? Or I guess they've just managed to cope, or they've managed to look past it and managed to just say, well, they just figured them out.
Well, I think that's true in relationships. We can often cope or look past it. But then I do believe after a time, and it's different for
Yeah.
every couple, after a time it becomes unsupportable
Hmm.
and you really can't live with it anymore. And that's when I see them, is the person comes in and say, I can't live with this anymore. So you've got to stop. And the problem is at that time, they've been together for 10 years. This person's probably been doing it, lying since they were, an adolescent. And in the assessment, that's one of the things I try and understand is, when did this start?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it almost always starts in adolescence.
Okay.
And there are various reasons why it starts, but it goes back typically to adolescence. And so that person has been dealing with this problem for a long time. But the question, I still don't know the answer. Would you end a marriage because of this? And I can see both sides.
Yeah.
I don't know how you have that intimate relationship if you can never trust the person.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it depends if the person is willing to change. I also think it depends on the way they lie, or I guess how they are lying, right? Because I think sometimes pathological liars, they will lie only about certain things, right? I think that can be true as well. Like there's only certain
Oh, sure,
instances
sure.
that they lie about. Like,
No, I understand what you're saying. And here's the problem with that, because I have seen that where, they're in a relationship, one of the partners only lies about a certain area of their life. The
yeah.
problem is, though, I've seen it tends to generalize, and the other partner then starts to doubt everything.
Yeah.
It's really hard for the partner who's being lied to be able to see how it's compartmentalized, or even to put boundaries around it. Like, to be able to say, oh, my partner only lies about this one thing. Granted, I see the couples who are struggling. I haven't seen that happen. It generalizes to, I can't trust him about anything.
Yeah.
If he's late coming home from work and he gives me a reason, how do I trust that?
Yeah.
Because he lies about this thing over here all the time. So why should I trust him when he's telling me where he's been? And so it generalizes. And that's the reason they end up coming in for treatment, is that it just becomes too hard to stay in the relationship.
Right. Well, I mean, and the thing too is once you start lying about one thing, it almost like it builds. Like you have to keep telling more lies to keep the lie going. That's another big problem with lies.
That is true, because I had a couple this week, and I mean, I never say this in session. Like, I question whether or not I think he's given this lie to his partner, and you can't back out of it. If you lie, you put yourself in this corner, and it gets bigger and bigger, and the longer it goes on.
Yeah.
No, I didn't do that. No, I didn't do that. Even if you did, the harder it becomes to actually come back and say, oh, you're right. I lied to you. That is really, really tough. I'm trying to think if I ever seen that happen. Because there are some cases where you can actually have some proof that the person's lying, but they still hold on to the lie. They will not give it up. And so I think you're right that it becomes very hard to back out of a lie once you've given it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because eventually the truth will out. I mean, the truth always comes out one way or another.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I've heard all sorts of excuses. They make up, weird excuses as to why what they're saying is true. And, like somebody else did this. I mean, it becomes really big, fast, and kind of fantastical, really fast. And, it's hard for the person themselves who's giving the lie to understand how fantastic this sounds. The explanation they're giving, where everybody else who's listening to it is going, this doesn't make any sense at all. And it's hard for them to see it because they're so deep into the lie. Right.
Well, and I think sometimes another way I can see, and I think I've seen this before, is people will embellish things. Right?
Well, that's part of that pathological line.
Right. Is they embellish things, and usually they're doing it to make themselves be perceived a certain way.
Right. Or to say, well, this is really true. Look how true this is, because this big thing happened. That's what makes it true.
Yeah. Yeah. Which can be very difficult. So if you're in an intimate relationship, or if you're trying to be in a relationship, it's got to be really tough to make it work. I think you have to break the habit. That's the only way to move forward, because if you can't break the habit, I don't know how you can stay in the relationship, because I mean, trust is kind of the foundation.
Right. Well, it is the foundation. And so here's the way I approach it. And I think it can work. I'm trying to think if I've had the experience where someone has gotten better with this. But so the first step is the person has to understand and accept that they have this problem. You can't move forward if the person is resisting this idea that they are a pathological liar. But I think once you accept that and say, yes, you're right, then I think you move to the next step, which is, so how do you change this? And if you go down the road of saying, well, it's a habit, which I really believe it is, then habits are just, if we think of habits, it's just the way our brain is wired.
Yeah.
Then I think if you can help them understand that this is a brain issue. See, because if you take it away from being a moral issue, because if it's a moral issue, then the person, it's really easy for them to get into that shame cycle. I'm a bad person, this and that. But if you can, I was going to say externalize it, although the brain is pretty internal, but, externalize it from being a moral issue to this is a brain issue. And then you can go down the road of, okay, how do we change the brain? How do we make new connections? And the only way to make new connections is through different behavior. So this is what it looks like in very simple terms, is the person has to realize they're lying. Now, that can be tough.
Yeah.
But they have to be willing to acknowledge, once they, throw out a lie, to be able to acknowledge or say, okay, I just lied. And that's why going back to the acceptance is pretty important. They can't do that unless they've accepted. But if every time they lie, and it's not going to happen every time at first, but when they lie, if they can stop and say, okay, and I think verbally is good, especially if you're with your partner, that you can say, okay, I just said a lie. Here's the truth. So they have to change it. And they can even say, I want to do this in a different way. Here's what the truth is. And so what you're doing is you're acknowledging the lie, and then you're saying, I want to change it, and here's the correction.
Yeah.
The more consistent you are with that, what you're doing is you're actually changing your brain and you're making new connections. That's the way out of it. Now, it's easy for me to describe it. It's very hard to do.
Yes, I think that's important to acknowledge.
For people.
Yeah.
But I think that if you are committed to changing that, I believe you can over time, but both the person who's lying and if they're in a relationship, the partner, you have to be understanding and patient that it is not a straight line from I'm lying to I'm not lying anymore. That is never going to happen.
Right.
And so you have to be willing to go through that process. That's why I like to explain it in terms of what the brain is doing, because most people can understand that, and most people can understand that it takes time to change that.
Right.
But I do believe that people can change. Now, in the case of a pathological liar, though, the other piece is I think you have to get to the underlying pathology.
That's what I was going to bring up next is why are they doing it? And so, in case of a childhood trauma, this is a learned coping mechanism.
Right.
Oftentimes, I think that if they are triggered, and we know that there's a part of the brain that has no temporal component. And so, and so oftentimes you can be triggered by something that is, and it can be completely unrelated, but when you feel triggered, your brain is back in that moment of trauma. And
you go right back to
that coping mechanism. And so in that instance, it is so important to address that trauma and to work through that trauma in some ways, because otherwise you're never going to be able to. And in that case, that's probably a little easier to, at least if you're in an intimate relationship with them, that's got to be a little bit easier to cope with, because then at least you can understand and you can say, okay, I can see you're being triggered by a trauma, right? And this is a little bit outside of your control at first. And so it's a little bit easier to work with. I think what's harder to work with is when the person believes their lies. And I've had this experience before, is where somebody believes the lie, and oftentimes it's maybe a past event that's happened and they genuinely remember it differently. They remember it happening. So here's an example or a story that my dad gave, right? So someone goes fishing with a group of people and everybody catches 6 fish, right?
Yeah.
And at first the person says, yeah, we all caught 6 fish. And in the end, we all had, I don't know, we had 24 fish, right? And as the time goes on, he's like, well, I caught some of the fish. And he's like, well, I caught half of the fish. and he changes the story just a little bit until
Right.
this person genuinely believes they caught all of the fish. That's a lot harder to overcome because they genuinely believe the lie. And I think that people can perceive something in such a way that they obscure the truth.
Right. But, we've talked about memory.
Yeah.
And the perception that a lot of people have about memory is that it's like a recording device and, you're recording the truth all the time. But memories are constructed.
Yes.
And so what you just described is exactly what happens is, someone over time constructs a memory and it changes. Now, one of the reasons that I like doing couples work is if you're seeing a pathological liar individually, they will lie to you.
Yeah.
So they're going to lie to their therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons I think it's important to have two people is the partner usually keeps them a little more honest.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say. And so from my perspective, it's helpful if you're dealing with someone who's lying to have someone in the room who actually lives with them and experiences it. Because otherwise, as a therapist, really your only choice is to believe what the person tells you. If you're in an individual setting, because I have absolutely no other information. And so having a partner in the room really solves that problem, that dilemma.
Yeah. And I would say in the instance of, when someone believes their own lies, I would say that's probably more likely to be a case of narcissism.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right.
Yes.
Because in that instance, oftentimes they believe their lies, and usually the lie is about making themselves look better.
Right. Right. I agree. So, if you're seeing someone on their own, I'm trying to think if I've ever had that experience of seeing an individual who comes in and says, I lie a lot. How can I change? I would approach it in the same way as I just described it, that, here are the steps you can go through to change it. It's just that you never are quite sure as the therapist, what's the truth in what they're telling you in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
But that's why I just believe them, because it's too hard. It can drive you crazy if you're always trying to think, okay, is that true? Is that true? Is that false? I mean, as a therapist, you can't do that.
Right. And again, as a therapist, they're seeking help from,
Right.
Help from you. Your job is to help them.
Right.
Not be their moral compass.
Right. And if you go back to what you said, though, I think that often they're truly believing what they're telling you. And so that's the place you have to start from.
Yeah.
You can't ever say, well, that doesn't sound correct to me, or that sounds too, fantastical to me. You never say that. You just go with what they're presenting and that they believe it.
Yeah, because it's not like they're going to sit here and tell you, I have this blonde hair when their hair is clearly black.
Right.
It's not like it's going to be a lie like that, like a lie they can't believe. So it has to be something that is believable. Like, an example could be, I have so many friends and I have so many people that I can turn to for help. And the reality is no one's willing to help them.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good example of how you can, fabricate something and believe it. So the takeaway is, two parts. Being in a relationship with a pathological liar is very difficult.
Yeah.
If they don't acknowledge it and change it, I don't see how the relationship survives.
Yeah.
But if you're that person who's the pathological liar and you can acknowledge it, I think there's a way out of it, but you have to really frame it in terms of your brain is developed this way.
Yeah.
And so you have to change the brain.
And I think it's important to not make it about morals, because, I really appreciate that. Because as you said, if you make it a moral issue, they're more likely to get defensive.
Yeah.
And again, that shame spiral, which shame is not helpful.
Right. I agree. I'm trying to even think, is this a moral issue? If you're really calling someone a pathological liar, there's some underlying pathology.
Yeah.
Their brain is different. They could have had traumatic experiences. I don't think it's a moral issue. I think it's a brain issue.
Yeah.
And I think it's more effective to think of it that way.
Yeah, I agree. It's more helpful, and it's more likely that the person is going to seek treatment.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I didn't realize that until we were talking about it. I hadn't thought about the moral component of it, but I think that's true. It's a brain issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I think where it can get a little more muddy is if it is someone like maybe a family member, a sibling or a parent. That I think would be really difficult.
So again, going back to what you said, the only thing you can do is create good boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And we've, at least I've said before, I think one of those boundaries in the end can be that you limit your contact with this person.
Mm-hmm.
Because even if it's a sibling, I mean, you can accept that your sibling has this issue and you can accept that it's hard for them to change it. That doesn't mean you have to be around it all the time.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's a personal choice for everyone. That's different for every person.
Right. And the amount of contact is going to be different too,
Right. But I just want to point out that as a boundary, limiting your contact with family members is, in my opinion, always an option.
Yeah. And limiting contact does not necessarily have to mean eliminating contact. I think that's an important distinction.
That's right. And I agree with that. We've talked about that before, that I think eliminating contact, in my mind, is really like a last resort.
Yeah.
Like something is so terrible that you really can't live with it, or you're afraid for your own emotional health, or say the emotional health of your children, if we're talking about family members. And so sometimes you do have to make that decision.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Okay. So next week we are going to get into suicide prevention. So September is Suicide Awareness Month, right? And so we dedicate the entire month of the podcast to suicide.
Have a good week, everyone.
We will see you all next week. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.